very much for having me, Aaron. So my name is Stanton, and I am the president at Reset, which is a standard for healthy and sustainable buildings. I'll talk more about it later. Today, I'm invited to kind of share a bit about what we do and how this applies to potentially the topic that Baltimore Climate Tech Plus is sharing today. So the specific title I'm using today is going to be measuring the health and sustainability of high performance homes. The focus is on residential this time. So let's dive right in. I'm going to do a quick introduction to what Reset is, and then we'll go into the topics that I have to share today. So we're a building standard. We have 300 plus projects across 21 countries. Although we're not as well known, there is a bit of traction on our side. Our standard kind of applies to different types of buildings or offices or retail environments. So it's very holistic. It touches upon a bit of everything. And the focus of what we're doing is developing performance standards. So high performance is a really important detail for us. And to make high performance possible, there's a lot of data that needs to be managed. So we build software to help do that. And with the data, you can then do benchmarking. That's the core of what we do. And then after that, it's audit and certification as the core business model. And then lastly, we do a lot of capacity building within organizations. So with some larger landlords, what we sometimes work with them on is internal processes, establish standards, and then tools to help them measure performance at scale for their portfolio. So that's more on like a individual consulting side of things. One thing that we do for building performance standards is that it's typically something that we do with an organization first before we make it public. So everything is based off of a real project at some point before we make it more widely accessible. So I'm going to go through 4 different topics today. One is why high performance is mainly about data. Number 2 is how we approach operational health and sustainability. Number 3 is a topic that's relatively new, but equally important, embodied carbon. So that's something I'll touch upon in terms of how we're handling it. And then lastly, just a few takeaways for this presentation. So let's start with high performance equals data. The reason why I'm starting with this is because I think from our perspective, looking at high performance is really about understanding what or how a building is actually performing. And without data, it's almost impossible to do this. SMART is another topic that's brought up in this event, which is also important for high performance. And this is also related to data. Smart buildings are essentially leveraging data to automate or leverage AI to make a building more responsive to basically be automatic. So all of this is related data. And the core of what Reset does is we believe that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that derives into, it essentially derives into everything that's high performance or smart related. So for high performance, one thing that we think is really important is leveraging more than just modeling and going towards actual measurements. Modeling, you're based on a design, based on an algorithm, but you're not actually going to get exact measurements of how it's going to finally operate. And the smart part is if you want to automate your building, you have to have these measurements to automate with. Otherwise, if you're working off of a model, factors that you don't normally consider, for example, temperature, outdoor temperature, will impact everything that you estimated. So basically, the push is to have direct measurements. An example of requiring more data is just Local Law 97 from New York. They now require buildings to at least present with data that they can use to rank buildings. And this is being tied directly to how much tax a building might pay. So this would be an incentive of you need more data to measure how a building's performing, and yeah, a law that's pushing for that. Just in terms of modeling versus actual performance, uh, if we're comparing standards, one of the things with more traditional standards is that they're more generalist design standards. They're very powerful in helping you think holistically about an entire project. But what ends up happening is that there's less of a requirement in specific performance monitoring, which means that um, a lot of the results are modeled instead of actually measured. So that would be a difference between how we approach things versus traditional standards, which is we only care about the actual performance being measured versus anything that's modeled. So we don't look at anything qualitative, it's all quantitative data only. Okay, so going into more specific details on what do we mean by measuring. Our standard comes in two parts. There's the embodied, which touches on carbon, circularity, and health metrics for materials. I'll go into a little bit more of an explanation on what embodied is in a little bit. And then operational, which is looking at air, energy, water, and waste. So the air is kind of what we're most well known for. And this is the health part of indoor spaces and residential homes as well. We breathe, I mean, you have to breathe all the time, and we spend 90% of our time indoors. So making sure that we have good indoor air quality is really important. And the only way to really know that is to monitor in some way because air is changing all the time. In a lot of situations, what typically happens is there will be a construction phase, and then if there are any requirements for testing air quality in a space, you're going to be tested during a flush out phase, which is when you clean out the air and have all your windows open for a certain amount of time. But the issue with air quality is that there's a couple things that will affect it. PM 2.5 is going to be coming in from outdoor environments, and that's going to leak in regardless if your windows are open or closed. The other thing is that during occupancy, depending on the material choices that you have in your indoor environments, they can off-gas TVOC. So it is possible that you have poorer air quality than you think. Another example, I know that asthma is a big topic nowadays as well. Asthma can be affected by poor air quality. So recently, there's been in the past 2 years, there's been the wildfires, which is a huge source of PM 2.5 in the air. All of that will gradually leak into the indoor spaces at some point in time, even if all your windows are closed. So if you have some way to monitor and then also to clean the air while you're in an indoor space, you're going to be much better off than not having anything. So in some ways, not monitoring your air is a ignorance is bliss kind of situation because you just don't know. But if you want to actually care about it, there's a very simple way of a monitor and then having certain very simple strategies to kind of solve it. So for example, PM2.5, a simple filter will be enough. Just if the numbers are high, turn on your filter. And then for TVOC, it's bringing in as much fresh air as possible. So opening your windows if VOC levels are high is a very easy solution to high TVOC issues.
So Stanton, let me ask you a question.
Yep.
So the slide that you have up, construction phase, flush out phase, occupancy phase. On the residential side, if we're talking like passive house, for example, or zero energy ready, which is another, residential environmental certification, there's the construction phase, and then there's the blower test phase, to measure how much outside air is coming in home. And it needs to be a certain number, 0.4, 0.2. I don't know the exact number for passive house. But there is that phase, and then there's the occupancy phase. And I guess my question to you, I remember speaking to Rafer Wallace just in regards to, he said that passive house and reset are like a match made in heaven, in the sense that it really creates a tight envelope, but then you also have to measure and monitor what's happening on the indoors as well. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, you preempted me.
Oh,
Um,
I'm sorry.
so so I was going to talk about passive house right after this.
Okay, okay. Keep going. This is why I
Perfect.
ask the questions at the end.
No, no, no. This is perfect. So passive house, the design aspect of it is very strong on how do you have a building that is airtight so that from an energy perspective, you're very energy efficient. The issue with airtight buildings is that there's no airflow. And let's say a long time ago when we were living in shacks or whatever, um, you could burn stuff at home and it wouldn't be really an issue because all the air is leaking out. But when you have a very airtight home, a candle or anything that's burning at home, it's creating pollution in the air that's never going out. So passive house actually technically requires um, active active air movement where you have some kind of um, system that brings fresh air in. The key then is how do you make sure that you're getting enough fresh air, or if you have too much fresh air, how do you kind of control it? Reset would focus on essentially requiring the measurements of this. For commercial buildings, it makes a lot of sense for it to be third party certified, but for residential, the thinking of it is really you want the measurements or you want to see the numbers somewhere so that you can essentially tell your system what it needs to do when it needs to do it.
Or have it automated so that it does it on its own when the sensors pick up a negative situation when in regards to air quality.
Correct. So that would be the smart part. If it has the data, it can automate it.
Mhm, mhm.
And then just a few kind of examples of how to leverage this. This would be an example of a project that used monitors to kind of measure how much CO2 levels can be impacted by massing plants in an indoor space. So 6+ plants per person is what NASA did a research on. And what we were seeing when this project was live was CO2 levels at night would be lower than CO2 levels outside. So that's fun to see. This would be an example of automation. So this they did two things for automation. One is that they had um, monitors on every single floor. Both they went over above and beyond what we require. They had monitors for delivering air and the building delivering air into space, and also for from the return ducts. And so to automate, they did um, every system is automated on each floor, but on top of that, they have an alert system that notifies the facilities team whenever there's higher than normal numbers in the return duct. And so the fun story that we got for this was every time there were construction teams in there that weren't supposed to be in there during office hours, they would catch it before any work was already like they would catch it way before anything happened because right when any kind of construction started, they would detect PM2.5 or TVOC spikes, and then immediately they would send someone over and kick them out. So just it makes the building much more proactive rather than passive. Uh, Data also allows you to set KPI requirements. So facilities teams, if they've never been trained on air quality before and you want to tie air quality to the KPI of a facilities team to maintain good air quality, you have to measure for that to be possible. And then if you do any kind of remediation, spot tests are good to kind of get a glance of what's going on. But if you really want to see if a solution is going to end up working over time, you want to install monitors to see what is the issue over time. Is it happening during lunch hours only? Is it just a um, TVOC spike for because someone's drinking alcohol during lunch? That kind of stuff is much more obvious when you have longer term monitoring to see what's going on in the space. So even for air quality in homes, if you think you have an air quality problem, measuring it over time gives you a better understanding of what are the best solutions for solving your issue, and partially also what are the most cost effective ones. So on the operational side, just some other things that's included. We also look at energy, water, and waste, all of it focused on continuous monitoring. And the idea is that if you want to have a high performance building, you need to be measuring these things so that either you can benchmark against other projects to show that you're actually high performance, or you're setting it up for smarter buildings where you automate the processes. So the next part, we're going to go into embodied carbon. This one's going to be a little bit newer, so I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to the concept. Operational carbon and embodied carbon are two parts of a bigger thing called life cycle assessments. And operational carbon is the running of the building. So how much CO2 is generated when you're using the building. Mostly it's energy. From our perspective, this also includes water usage and waste generation. On the embodied side, you're looking at the materials that were required to build the building, and then how much CO2 it took to create those materials, ship it over, and then to put it together into the building. Why is embodied carbon important? This is a graph that shows the life cycle of a building. So over time, embodied carbon is flat and operational carbon goes up. This is under the assumption that embodied carbon, you build it once and then your entire building is kind of there for 50, 60 years. You don't have to do any upgrades to it, so it's flat. And then operational carbon obviously gradually goes higher over time. But the reality is quite different from that. So originally, that graph showed 19 years for operational carbon to hit 50% of total carbon of the building. The reality is that if we include interiors, interiors get upgraded a lot more often than the entirety of the building. So every time you upgrade your interiors, you're generating waste, which means that the embodied carbon actually rises over time. So instead of, let's say, 19 years from the previous graph, we're looking more at 37 years for embodied carbon and operational carbon to be equal. So just to highlight that embodied carbon actually plays a bigger role than we originally kind of estimated. And so the way that we look at embodied carbon is currently the market, if you're looking at different materials that go into spaces, it looks like this, where you have a bunch of different labels that highlight they're either healthy or they're very environmentally friendly. But unless you're digging into the 30-page report, you're not going to really know what's going on. So our approach, thinking from a high performance and measurable data perspective, our goal was to essentially pull the data out, equalize it so that you can compare apples to apples or chairs to chairs. We're not creating any new labels per se. We're just trying to take the data from what's available on the market to make it more comparable. And to set ambitious targets like 100 for carbon is 100% carbon neutral, 100 for circularity is 100% circular, and then 100 for health is free of all chemicals of potential harm. So most materials, it's impossible to get to that number of 100 because we just don't have a system in place, for example, for a product to be 100% recycled in terms of raw materials, and then 100% recyclable after its end of life. And then from a project perspective, the reason we have to look at individual products is that to get to a project score, we're essentially adding up all the materials in a project with the quantity, and then that's how you get a project score. Some things that you can do with the data is that you can now we come from more of a commercial perspective. So this is not as relevant for residential, but the same idea applies that you get a better understanding of exactly what's going on with the building. The health thing is probably where it is relevant. So one thing that we discovered is that there's a lot more toxic chemicals in our buildings than we expect because a lot of materials, how they're designed is that they have toxic chemicals, but they wrap it so that it's not off-gassing. But over time, as you use it for, let's say, 5 to 10 years, and there's constant rubbing on the surface layers, or there's heating and expanding of the products because, let's say, in the summer, when the space is not being air conditioned at night, it gets really, really hot. Those situations will make it so that products can potentially off gas in the future. So, um, making sure that you start understanding what materials go into a space is long term. Um, it's a longer term way to making sure that you're in a healthier space, and also from a sustainability perspective, uh, there's a very strong reason why we include carbon circularity and health together. And the
Can I
reason for
can I
this is,
can I ask you a quick
yeah,
question?
please.
You've got me very concerned about the chair that I'm sitting in right now and the harm it may be doing to my reproductive system. Um, does Reset or Giga track residential fixtures, finishes, and material products, or is it just commercial like chairs and adhesives and tables? Is it more tracking commercial items, or are you tracking residential items, bedding and kitchen cabinets, those types of things?
So right now it's mostly commercial, and the reason for this is because from a business perspective, what we discovered was that asking manufacturers to provide data doesn't really work unless there's a project in play. What I mean by that is, as a our organization initially started as a material tracking organization because the goal was to find better materials for architecture projects. And what we found out was when we're asking for data, or if we're asking them to provide additional data that they might not have, that requires them to spend time on at least looking for the data, or if they don't have the data, to pay to test for the data. None of that is interesting to them until there's an actual project that requires them to provide that data. Otherwise, they're not going to get into the project.
Makes
So
sense.
the way that we've been doing it now is we focus on the client, which is the owner of the project. We help them create templates on how to ask for data, and then that's how we're sourcing the data.
Mm,
So it's the incentives are more tied to, there is a project, you need to have this data for you to be um, part of this project. So if you cannot acquire this data through either testing or some kind of report, um, you're not in. You're not going to get into the project. So that's kind of been what we've been doing recently for collecting data. It's also the only way to get the latest data, because if a manufacturers never been asked, like they were asked for, let's say, 5 years ago. If they were
mm,
never asked again for it, they're never going to update the report. There's no reason for them to.
mm.
So that's been the focus. On the residential side, we would need to create a way to incentivize these products to do it. Recently, we've been talking with um, certain products, or actually platforms that sells products, on how to create a system to actually highlight some of this data. So there might be a possibility that in the near future, there's going to be more visual data for carbon circularity and health for actual residential products, but we're still kind of in the early stages of figuring out how to make that possible.
Yeah, the stat that I heard was that there's 95,000 chemicals that go into the construction of every home, just from different
Yeah,
materials.
fire retardants is the big one.
Mm,
Um, what we talk about in the health part doesn't even include all the plastic that goes into everything that we use.
mm,
So there's now a lot of studies talking about how plastic gradually affects your health over
mm.
time. Um, but yeah, the where I was going with this though was that these three are very tightly connected. The first connection is between carbon and circularity. When people ask for lower carbon products, the answer to it is typically not a carbon, like a lower carbon product, but a higher circularity product. And the reason for it is because in embodied carbon, there is a element called regeneration, which is essentially saying, if you can recycle this product completely, then this actually can subtract from your embodied carbon score. So that is essentially all about circularity. And then how circularity ties with health is that if a product has a lot of harmful chemicals in it, it's very hard to recycle afterwards. And so that would be an example of if you have very um, if you have a product that's very toxic, it's very hard to recycle in any way, which means that it's very hard to decrease the carbon for this. And just for a fun example, this is my go-to example for how some of these relate. A product, there was a product that was very popular at one point, which was uh, coffee cups made of coffee grounds or furniture made of coffee grounds.
Hmm.
And from a carbon perspective, this is very, very good because it's very low in carbon. But the problem is that you're using glue to put it together, which means that from a circular perspective, you can never recycle it. Originally, coffee grounds is fully biodegradable, 100% circular in terms of the end of life. But with the epoxy glue putting it together, it's 0% circular at the end of life, which means you have a very good carbon score, but you have a very, very poor circularity score. And that's kind of how these two relate to each other.
I think I recall reading the Starbucks case study that you all did where they recycled, was it coffee cups into the aprons?
Yes.
Okay, okay. I thought I had that right. Okay. It's interesting.
Yeah. And just kind of building off of that, most things from a construction perspective are thrown away, which means when you demolish a building or when you demolish your residential interiors, 94% of it is going to landfill. The idea for what we want to think about is if we can track more of this stuff, um, it's possible to reduce carbon 45 to 68% by just um, figuring out how to reuse more of this. And this actually ties into some of the policies that is happening in Maryland. So HB, what's the number? HB 538 is asking for more modular homes. The
Hmm.
modular homes part is really interesting because you know exactly what the materials are. If you can do additional research and analytics on exactly what the carbon circularity and health is, and then have a method of recycling it afterwards, we're talking about buildings and homes are much lower in carbon than anything else on the market. So
Hmm.
modular is actually the way to go. It's just that from what we've seen so far, modular homes haven't taken that extra step to measure all of this and set up a end of life cycle for these homes. If they added that piece, this would be a slam dunk.
You know, what's interesting is I've been thinking about the theme for next year's conference, and it is going to be in and around the truth about modular construction and just the challenges with it. I visited three factories last month, two in Pittsburgh, one in Delaware, and they're doing, zero energy homes. They're not building to like the reset standard. They hadn't heard of it until I approached them about it. They're not building to the well standard quite yet, but they are building, they're focused on energy. Um, but I think there's a huge opportunity in a wide lane for modular construction, offsite construction, and really focus on exactly what you just said. So I'm excited to
Agreed.
explore that opportunity.
Um, and then just with the data, there's benchmarking opportunities. And what we typically do is once you have the data, there's also recommendations that we provide for projects who have measured. So once you measure, you can figure out where to focus on. Mainly, we look at what things have the highest quantity in a project, and then we optimize for that. Um, to kind of handle all the data, we also have a system to automatically give recommendations based on
Mhm.
the score and data that's already been collected for a project. So you can optimize for, let's say, if you want something that's lower in carbon or higher in health, you can kind of play with the numbers. And I think the thing for residential that we want to see in the long run is that more products are required to do product passports. So in the EU, they're now requiring digital product passports for more and more products. And what this means is just there's a way to kind of find out more about a product. And from our perspective, the most important thing, aside from the typical information you find, is more details around um, circularity, carbon, health, but also having the data to back it up. So I think the powerful thing about a digital product passport is once you have it, you can put as much information as you need to in there. It's not, you're not limited by like a small tag. And
Mhm.
so like, for example, scanning this QR code would take you to an information page with details backing up why you got this carbon score, why it's 60% recycled content, where's the report, what does it say? And I think to kind of push away from using just pure labels, which makes things much easier to greenwash, having the data to back up your statements is going to be really critical in the future.
So let me make sure I'm understanding where this is going. On my phone, I can use Google and I can scan an object, and then it'll pull up whatever the name of the object, where I can purchase it or where it's from.
Yeah.
Are you envisioning a scenario where one could walk through an office or a home, scan a material with a mobile app or a phone, and be able to determine the carbon circularity and health of that individual piece of material?
In the long run, yes.
Mm.
So right now, what we're seeing in the EU is that they're starting to require you to be able to scan a QR code to see more of this information.
Okay.
So you know how like in most products there's a tag, right? The tag normally just has a barcode, mainly for purchase purposes.
Mm.
But if you have a QR code that you scan, it basically takes you to a website, and there's going to be a certain amount of information that needs to be presented there. there's there's no specific requirement for like publishing your carbon data or anything of that sort at this point in time yet. But we see once you have that space to be able to talk about your story, your like show pictures and all that stuff, then you start having the opportunity to push for a stronger sustainability story where you're actually talking about sustainability with data backing up your claims.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's a future that we envision. And the idea that we can take a picture of a product to do the same thing makes perfect sense. It's just will the products have that information? Or let's say, for example, Amazon, um, you can take a picture, buy something on Amazon. If Amazon makes it a thing where all the products on that's listed on their site requires a certain amount of carbon circularity or health data to be also shown,
Hmm.
um, then we have real industry buy-in to push for this because maybe it's just about ranking products. If there's a filter that you can rank for carbon circularity or health, it creates incentive from a business perspective to get this information
Yeah,
and
I
design for
mean,
better products.
gosh, I can get this information on my Wheaties box. Why can't I get it on my paint or my carpet or whatever is causing problems in my home?
Yeah. So this would be going into policy. Um, Government policy has a lot more rules around food, but very little rules around things that we use every day. That's
Hmm.
not food.
Hmm.
So um, an example of kind of where we see this industry going, a few case studies. This is an example of a Starbucks project that initially did Reset Embodied. Their score was 50% of the store can be recycled or biodegraded at the end of life. The next one that they did went up to 67%. So we see this as an iterative process where you first get a baseline when you're measuring. And then once you've measured the first time, you can start looking at ways to improve because you're going to be looking at you're going to be exploring potential new products that can be used because now you have a baseline to work off of. This would be an example of a team that leveraged us during the design phase. And so by looking at the materials early on and doing a measurement of materials that are already on your bill of materials, there's an opportunity to switch out materials that are used a lot to increase your score. This is an interesting company because they do furniture leasing. It's similar to the modular buildings kind of concept where you have these systems that are easily replaceable and they take things back because their business model is to not put things in landfill, but to reuse as much as possible. So if let's say modular buildings become very popular, the main thing that really needs to be thought about is how do you repair parts of the modular building without having to toss everything into the
Mhm.
landfill. This is just an office that has done net zero for operational and embodied carbon. For embodied carbon, what they did was number one, when they moved their office to this space, they reused as much of the furniture and actually the floor paneling, wall paneling from their old office to this one, uh, because we were telling them how this will affect their circularity score. And the second thing that they did was they bought carbon credits to offset everything. So I know carbon credits has like a bit of a greenwashing kind of um, thing around it, but it just depends on what credits you're getting. If you can find good credits, it's still valuable. The other part is that they're also net zero from an operational perspective because this is in a shopping mall that they own. So this is an office tower connected to a shopping mall. And on top of the entire shopping mall building, there is a bunch of solar panels. And the solar panels are not being measured in any way and applied to any part of the building. So what they brought us in for was to measure exactly how much energy was being generated through solar, which was being used by the entire building. And then we measured how much energy was being consumed by their office. And then we basically matched that. If energy produced by the solar panels was higher than that of the usage in the office, they would be considered net zero. So that's how we certified that space. And because we're live monitoring everything, we have data to show every single day, every single month of the year.
Mhm.
The last one I want to share is this is a project where they reused a bunch of the old buildings. So all the like buildings in the middle, these are structured. These are like 50-year-old buildings, old buildings from Shanghai. And what this property did was instead of demolishing it, they refurbished everything and made it part of the larger project. And so, number one, from a looks perspective, um, it's very cool in the sense that you have a mix of new and old. And the other part is that from a carbon perspective, by not having to take all of this building waste, or by not creating all this building waste, you've essentially reduced the carbon significantly because you're not moving all of this to landfill and you're not having to rebuild all these structures as well. So this is another example of carbon reduction by not demolishing the entirety of the old buildings. So final takeaways, just three things I want to kind of mention. If you want to do high performance, it's all about data. You have to collect the data to be able to benchmark yourself against others, or if you want to do any kind of smart building related stuff. The second one is performance versus modeling. Just if you really want to make sure that you're high performance, you have to do measurements versus just using algorithms and a model. They're not going to be always the same. And the last one is if you can think about the whole picture, measuring operational is the first step, but if you can start thinking about embodied as well, it does play a big role in both the holistic sustainability and health of our everyday spaces. And the last thing I'll mention is this is kind of how we think about the journey nowadays. The first step to any change is to measure and understand your impact. The second one is to look for ways to gradually improve. And this is going to be iterative. You're never going to get there in one step. It's going to be multiple steps over time. And once you've kind of gone the MVP, kind of the initial product concepts to gradually improve, then it's to look at scale. How do you grow this much faster? So automation, AI, all of that is powered by data in some way. So again, it's starting with measuring. And then lastly, it's how do you communicate it? So is it through building standards? Is it through articles or plaques on the wall? All of that is communication. And if you have data to back up your stories when you're communicating, it's even stronger. So thank you very much. That's it.
That was great, Stanton. Thank you so much. So our thesis last year, and this is your second year participating in Baltimore Climate Tech. So I appreciate that. And we've done, breakouts since then as well. So you've always been available to enlighten us on what Reset and Giga is up to. So I thank you for that. But our thesis for last year is the same this year. The building is the database. Whether you're actually capturing the data that the building has generated, it really separates you from one that's not and focused based on design and just not actual performance. You mentioned energy modeling versus air quality performance. The good thing about you being probably one of the last presenters is that I've had an opportunity to listen kind of where the industry is when it comes to healthy, smart, high performance homes. And it's like what Dr. Joseph Allen talked about, where, we're spending 90% of our efforts focusing on the 1%, which is energy. And nobody's really talking about the 90%, which is the health and wellness of the building occupant. And so, we heard a lot about energy modeling. We heard a lot about passive house, which is all great. We heard a lot about other, environmental certifications. But I'm always the one needing to bring up health and wellness of building occupants. What about the health and wellness of building occupants? Like, who's measuring that? Who's validating that the building's doing what you paid a premium for the building to do? Um, I know that the building industry is the least digitized, declining in productivity, and has a strong resistance to change. But what would you say is the biggest barrier from transitioning from energy modeling to actually validating the air quality and net zero operational carbon, embodied carbon? What's the biggest barrier standing in the way?
I think the main thing is that there's a lot more um, accounting that's being tied to energy than there is to health.
Mhm.
So, what I mean by that is if we look at how things are financed, or if we look at policies around the world, the thing that's easily measured right now is um, energy consumption. So the reason why operational energy is so much more talked about than embodied carbon is because embodied carbon is harder to measure. You don't have the data, and it's harder to set policies around. With the operational carbon, it's much more straightforward. It's just how much energy you consume. So optimizing for that is much more obvious. Um, and there's a lot of investments, let's say from Northern Europe, that's very focused on sustainable buildings. There's a lot of talk about sustainability, especially with climate change becoming much more obvious than ever before. And so we see a lot of, let's say, government initiatives where they're specifically sponsoring certain types of programs that are focused on sustainability versus health.
Mhm.
On the health side, the hard part is that it's not health impacts over time. So it's not something that's immediately obvious. And you don't really, let's say, if it's commercial spaces, the employer doesn't have to directly do anything for the health side of things because there's insurance, right? Insurance takes care of it. Our focus has never been on preventative healthcare. It's more been on just traditional healthcare, which is you have an issue, you go solve it. But
Mhm.
we don't look for ways to make sure we don't get the issue in the first place. And so, because preventative healthcare is not really in our mindset, thinking about good air quality or all that kind of stuff becomes kind of pushed back into the um, like it just doesn't. It's not in the front part of our mind in terms of what we
Mhm.
think about.
Mhm.
And I think the best way to kind of from my perspective or our team's perspective, our thinking is number one is obviously getting more visibility around it. That's one thing. But to be honest, the real way to kind of push it forward is to tie it very clearly with money and not just from a modeling perspective. We have to figure out a way to either governments require it, otherwise they're paying, a higher tax, or there's some method that links it directly with having good air quality means less cost or more benefits in some way from a monetary perspective. If we don't get there, I think it's going to be very difficult to have health be a front and center in front of sustainability. Um, but yeah, I think that would be a biggest roadblock, just a lack of connection between air quality or health in general with money.
Well, I think that's exactly where nonprofit hospitals and healthcare institutions could play a vital role. Here in the States, they're required to you know, uh, regenerate community benefit dollars as part of their nonprofit status back into community for building healthy, smart, high performance homes. So maybe it's maybe looking to the healthcare industry as opposed to the traditional construction building industry for this innovation, because then it becomes, we're not having emergency visits for asthma, which cost about $1,000. You get admitted overnight for an emergency situation, that's $10,000. And that happens a couple of
True.
times a year. You know what I mean? On top of the fact that the average household spends $3,000 to $5,000 a year just kind of managing asthma, of which Baltimore City has the second highest rate of asthma fatalities in the country. So I think our local healthcare institutions are kind of getting it, and so it's just kind of making that match. So I appreciate you saying that. My last question is, and this has been great. Every time we talk, we take a deeper dive, and I really appreciate that. You mentioned offsite construction twice without my prompting. And are you seeing any anything that you can talk about? Any reset offsite construction case studies, and coming down the pike? Are you seeing any countries that are innovative and really kind of the embodied and operational carbon perspective for offsite construction? What are you seeing from your perspective when it comes to advanced offsite construction?
For like an entire project, we haven't really seen complete offsite construction. It's more just we saw projects gradually moving towards modular builds because it directly affects their circularity and carbon scores.
Mhm.
So, um, one of the examples would be Starbucks. When we started working with them on some of the projects, what they started seeing after we showed them the data, they started looking at how do we improve. And
Mhm.
when we're looking through the other options that they had, contractors that they work with, or furniture, interior design teams that they work with, we saw teams that were working with a lot of modular stuff. And the modular stuff that's built in a way where you can move things around really easily. And because a lot of pieces are exactly the same, where you could,
Mhm.
replace certain parts of it instead of demolishing too many things, and also
Mhm.
take this piece and then move it to, like, let's say another store. Because the designs were consistent, there was a lot more flexibility, and they also worked with the modular factory to be able to recycle some of the pieces that were used afterwards. So
That makes so much sense.
it's
I mean, duh.
yeah. And so part of this was the experience of working with that company that I showed earlier of leasing furniture, because they don't lease just the furniture, they lease all of the interiors, as in your wall paneling, all that stuff. And their factory is designed to refurbish everything to almost new, so that can be used again up to 4 times is their kind of story. So we've seen them used at least up to 3 times now for some of their products. And so it's exciting to think about, if you have something that's being created that's always the same and it's
Mhm.
designed to be reused because part of the business model is to lease it,
Mhm.
then circularity scores improve, which means that the life of a product goes from, let's say, 5 to 10 years now to 20, 30 years.
Mhm.
That's already decreasing carbon 3 times approximately.
Especially in office where every 3, 5, 7 years, the office is demolished, sent to the dump. Somebody comes in, rebuilds and customizes a fit to their use case. They move out in 3, 5, 7 years. The office is demolished, and
Yep.
such a repetitive cycle that it doesn't need to be that way. So, Stanton, man, your thought leadership, your subject matter expertise, you hit our conference theme this year, as you always do. Thank you for your time, and your commitment to what we're doing here in Baltimore. I appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to think through the topics.
Absolutely. All right, Stanton, have a great day. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
All right.
Bye bye.
Bye.